Dinosaurs may have gone extinct once before, but they've been remarkably resilient with their second chance at life. Because 32 years and now 6 sequels after Steven Spielberg resurrected them in Jurassic Park, they just keep chugging along. But as the original movie kind of like famously mused, the ability to bring dinos back and keep them around does not necessarily mean that we should do so. So does Jurassic World Rebirth bring some of like the movie magic back to the series? Or is it another reminder that perhaps it's just time to let these dinos fade back into extinction? I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So I'm a huge fan of like the original Jurassic Park, and I actually think that the Lost World, like the first sequel, is a lot better than it often seems to get credit for. But after that, things have been pretty rough, with the last several films, to me, being like borderline unwatchable. And like the trailers and marketing material for this film were just dreadful, and like didn't instill me with any sort of optimism for the film. But I think as a pleasant surprise, Jurassic World Rebirth is actually pretty good, at least relatively speaking. It's arguably like the best of the batch of like unimpressive sequels, and I think a film that finally does capture like some of the thrills and like wonder of the original film, even if I do think that it ultimately struggles to like justify a reason for its existence. Story-wise, you know the drill. A group of mostly one-dimensional characters are stranded on yet another island with hungry dinosaurs. And like this time around, the catalyst involves like a mission to retrieve samples from like the 3 biggest dinos to manufacture some medicine that will actually, let's be honest, like none of it really matters. It's all just, an excuse to watch characters run around screaming and like trying not to become dino dinner. I will say though that like the plot almost unfolds with like the structure of like a video game, like more like a sequence of like episodic set pieces than it is like a cohesive story, as like the heroes sort of traverse the island collecting the various samples, like levels, before facing down like the big final boss at the end. There are sort of like 2 main parallel storylines that like only occasionally actually like intersect. One features sort of the Scarlett Johansson-led mercenaries that are on like that sample seeking mission, and the other follows like a family that they encounter along the way. And I think it does work in the sense that like the first sort of storyline provides the action, while the second provides more like the emotional heart. But I think the separation of the plot into those 2 like parallel tracks does leave the film feeling just a bit like unfocused and like even jumbled at times, almost like watching like 2 different movies simultaneously. While like the narrative template may remain fairly fixed, there are, I think, some impactful changes like behind the camera, because original screenwriter David Knopp returns for the first time since 1997's The Lost World, and Gareth Edwards steps into the director's chair for the first time. And I do think like both make their presence felt in very like positive ways, because like Knopp's sort of storytelling sensibilities result in Rebirth feeling more like a direct sequel to Spielberg's like vastly superior originals than they do sort of the later like Jurassic World era of films. Because in many ways to me, like, this feels more like Jurassic Park 3 than like the actual Jurassic Park 3 does. And Edwards, I think, is also a major upgrade for the series, obviously post Spielberg. And he demonstrates, I think, some very impressive like camera work and like use of lighting, particularly like in the final scenes. And I think maybe more importantly, I think he also just returns a sense of like awe and reverence for the central creatures, with one giant caveat that we'll get to in just a moment. But there's like a scene in this in which characters like stand kind of like in astonishment like before some giant dinos that is very much, and I would assume intentionally so, kind of like reminiscent of like the original's initial reveal of the dinosaurs, and I think just invokes a sense of like wonder that I think has been like sorely missing from kind of this increasingly cynical series. And the story is like far from groundbreaking, but I do think that Jurassic World Rebirth is a perfectly serviceable sort of like summer blockbuster. I mean, it's very predictable. I mean, like, there's no mystery whatsoever about like which characters exist to like carry the plot and which are present merely to be eaten. But I do think kind of like along the way, there are several like thrilling kind of action scenes, including like a standout like river sequence with a T-Rex that was sort of in Michael Crichton's like original novel, but kind of famously not included in Spielberg's film. But now for the one aforementioned caveat, and humor me for a bit of a soapbox, but I am just of the firm belief that kind of the downward spiral of the Jurassic Park series can be traced to the moment that Hollywood kind of inexplicably decided that dinosaurs were just no longer scary. Because the T-Rex, one of the baddest dudes in cinema history, has been largely sidelined for decades, and he appears in only a single sequence in this film, which I think not coincidentally is the film's best moment. But instead, the series has become kind of increasingly enamored with the idea of genetic hybrids and man-made monsters, and it's just all so dumb. And for a film that sort of otherwise treats the dinosaurs with a sense of reverence, shoehorning in a lazy and unnecessary subplot about genetic hybrids is just a giant swing and a miss. I think the climax of this film sees the heroes face off against just a totally goofy looking monster that feels like it belongs in another movie entirely, and I think ends the otherwise mostly solid film with just a giant whimper. Just personally, I think if we can't make giant carnivorous dinosaurs scary anymore, then perhaps it's just time to retire the franchise. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this, really not a whole lot. For language, there are 8 to 10 kind of minor profanities, including words that start with the letters S and D. And I think God and Jesus, the names are each used at least once. For violence, as you might expect, not all the characters make it out of this movie alive. There are several that are eaten by different dinosaurs. And you hear the screams and you see the jaws, chomp down around them. But there is very little blood that is shown. Perhaps the most graphic bit of violence is there is sort of a dismembered arm that is shown kind of left behind after one of those attacks. As far as themes, worldview, things going on beneath the surface, I think consistent with many of the Jurassic Park sequels, there is a very clear message just against corporate greed. Because in the series, you can usually tell how bad a character is by how much money they have. And in Rebirth, sort of the heartless, wealthy antagonists represent pharmaceutical companies who desire to produce the breakthrough medicine from the dino samples for financial profit rather than any kind of benevolent intention. Beyond sort of the base level, this condemnation of corporate greed, the film is also, I think, largely a story about redemption. Because Scarlett Johansson's sort of mercenary crew are initially on the mission for the sole purpose of just making a lot of money. And kind of throughout the film, they are pulled in a tug of war between sort of that greedy pharmaceutical representative and Dr. Henry Looms, who's a well-intentioned paleontologist who wants to sort of make the discoveries and knowledge publicly available. And in one of the film's sort of better dramatic scenes, 2 of those mercenary characters just chat about their broken lives, and one encourages the other that it's not too late to start doing the right thing and to start making choices that actually make a difference. And I think kind of in that way, the rebirth in the film's title probably refers more to the human characters than it does the dinosaurs. And it's not an overly nuanced or well-developed message, but I think centering the story on protagonists who are essentially anti-heroes is unique for the series and does allow for the telling of a classic kind of redemption arc. And the film doesn't explore that theme in any kind of religious context, although a character does remark that to kill a dinosaur would be a sin. But I do think the emphasis just on redemption is commendable and agreeable for Christians. So, in the end, I think the Jurassic Park series is clearly getting long in the tooth, but it does show that there is still at least a little bit of fight left in it. I think the recent sequels have frequently sort of functioned as a sort of meta commentary about how, overexposure to familiar spectacle no longer brings the same sense of awe and wonder that it once did. I think thankfully and refreshingly, Jurassic World Rebirth shuns sort of that cynicism and at least attempts to recapture some of that lost magic. And it is clearly made as a love letter to the original. And it's probably better and a more enjoyable film than it has any right to be, and at least more than the awful trailers made it appear. Even so, I think a movie about a world that's just ready for the dinosaurs to return to extinction, only for greedy corporations to keep them around for financial profit, feels a little bit on the nose and does make me wonder if the series has already had enough rebirths and it's just time to let a good thing die. But hey, I would love to hear what you think if you're, still tracking excited for the series, or maybe you're feeling kind of burnt out like I am. Either way, don't be shy. Jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about it. If you haven't done this too, encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a collider. Got lots of other movie reviews, got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast, got interviews, just other fun stuff. Would love to have you guys be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide with your world for Christ.